Thank you all for being here. It's fabulous to look out at all these people. I am Barbara Shatera. I'm one of the librarians here at the Fletcher Free Library, and I am delighted to be here for Bill McKibben. I just have a couple things to say. First, I want to thank Third Act and Queen City Indivisible for bringing Bill here, and for all the volunteers who set up those chairs that you're sitting in. It's a group project for sure. So, the restrooms upstairs on the mezzanine have been opened if you want to use them, and if you have a cell phone and it's not on vibrate or off, you might want to do that to avoid any future embarrassment. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn this over to Mark Wenberg, and he will introduce our next few speakers.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, my name is Mark Wenberg, and I am a steering committee member for the Queen City Indivisible group. And our group has a mission of seeking to preserve democracy, resist autocracy, and empower our community through nonviolent protests, actions, and local events such as this. And in Queen City Indivisible, there's a smaller committee that is we call ourselves the Community Committee, and we organize events that build community resilience, hope, connection, and engaged action. So that's what's happening tonight. There are some events that are very tricky and difficult to organize, local protests, for example. And then there are easy ones. And this one has to be one of the easiest events that I can think of that we've organized. I sent a cold email to Bill and said, we'd love to have you come. And about 5 minutes later, I got an email that said, sure, exclamation point. And then I knew Barbara from before, and I reached out to Barbara and I said, Barbara, we need a space. Would you be willing? And about 5 minutes later, I got an email that said, well, sure, exclamation point. And then, of course, Third Act Vermont, which are active here in the state and are co-hosts for this event. I want to thank Third Act Vermont. I want to thank Barbara from the library. And, of course, I want to thank Bill for coming this evening and sharing his insights. Couple quick things after the event. There will be book purchase and signing for Bill McKibben's book, and Phoenix Book is here. And then also an upcoming event on July 3rd. Queen City Indivisible for Burlington Rising is organizing called We Still Believe Float. It'll be down by the waterfront. It's going to be really fun. People dressing up in historical costumes, fortune cookies that have reinforce our Constitution. It's going to be a great event. There's flyers over there if you want to grab one. There's also over there a sign-up sheet for our newsletter to stay informed about all that we're doing. If you didn't sign up for it when you registered, you're welcome to do that. And then we are looking for volunteers for tabling at the farmer's market, a couple hours every other Saturday or so. If you are interested in that, please let us know and sign up over there. And I want to next introduce David McColgan. Thank you, from Third Act Vermont.
Good evening. My name is David McColgan. I'm on the coordinating committee for Third Act Vermont. And for those of you who don't know, Third Act is a group of seniors, those of us in the third act of our lives, pretty much over 60, who are fighting to save our democracy and our climate. And it's my great pleasure to be asked to introduce the founder of Third Act National, who is Bill McKibben, our speaker tonight. I think it's no exaggeration to say that Bill is truly one of our present-day heroes. He's somebody who has dedicated his life to educating and organizing around climate and social justice issues. His 1989 book, The End of Nature was his first book, and it was the first book for the general audience about climate change. He's written 20 more since then, including most recently Here Comes the Sun, which you can purchase over there at the table afterwards. He's also busied himself with writing countless articles for the New Yorker and for Rolling Stone and other articles as well. He's a professor of environmental studies at Middlebury College, and he has received many awards for all the work that he has been doing, including the Gandhi Peace Prize, the Right Livelihood Award in the Swedish Parliament, which is often referred to as the Alternative Nobel Prize. And Foreign Policy magazine named him as one of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. He helped found 350.org with a group of Middlebury College students several decades ago. And he's played a leading role in launching opposition to big oil pipeline projects like the Keystone XL and also the fossil fuel divestment campaign. That's actually how I first got to know Bill, was when, as a part of Third Act Vermont, we were organizing to get divestment legislation passed here in the state of Vermont several years ago. And as if all of that is not enough in one lifetime, he's even had a new species of woodland gnat named after him. And I have been practicing this all afternoon. It's called the Megolphthamidia McKibbeni. So, without anything further, I'm very honored to welcome Bill McKibben to the stage.
David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. You let me know if you can't hear me, okay? And all. What a pleasure to be in Burlington. What a pleasure, really, to be in Vermont for a few days. I've been on the road pretty much nonstop, and I think I'm going to be on the road pretty much nonstop through November, out mostly in the red states. I'm relatively confident that Becca Ballant is going to be returned to D.C., and so there are other places that we're fighting hard. But boy, it was the right weekend to be home in Vermont. So beautiful and so lush, and such a reminder of how, though somewhat damaged it is, it's still a remarkably beautiful world that we get to inhabit. I did actually give one talk in Burlington a few weeks ago. It was at halftime for the home opener of the Vermont Greens. And there I only talked for 90 seconds, so you should have come to that. It's also really fun to be here in this company. Enormous thanks to Indivisible for pulling off these No Kings rallies over the last year. I've had great fun working with Ezra and Leah at their national headquarters all year and plotting and planning, and have had great fun being out at No Kings rallies all over the country. I was in my hometown of Lexington, Massachusetts for the one before last to give the talk on the Battle Green, which was, if you think about it, arguably the site of the first No Kings rally in our country. And it really has been wonderful to have a vehicle for expressing what so many of us have been feeling in the course of this year. And it's been essential in the organizing that's beginning to tell now on our situation, we hope. Tonight, since you guys, I don't really have anything to tell you exactly about what we should be doing, I'm going to step back a little bit, if it's okay. Going to step back a little bit. Apparently I need to speak up a little bit too. Yes, okay. I'll just hold on to this thing and see if that helps. I'm going to step back a little bit, and as is the sort of wont of writers to do now and again, and sort of think of things in a slightly larger scale. And I'm going to try and make the argument tonight that there were, I'm a product of the 20th century, along with a few other people in this room. And I'm going to make the argument tonight that turns out there were two truly great inventions in the 20th century, and that our fate is linked in one way or another to both of them. The first of them was the solar panel. Solar cell, invented in 1956 in Edison, New Jersey at Bell Labs. If there's anybody in here who's old enough to have been putting dimes in payphones in the 1950s, then you helped support the first solar cell being developed. The second technology, second great invention of the 20th century was the nonviolent social movement. A kind of remarkable technology that shouldn't work but sometimes does, and that was invented very much on the margins by the suffragists, by Gandhi and his co-conspirators across India, by Dr. King and hundreds of thousands of other brave people in the American Civil Rights Movement, and on and on and on. So I'm going to try and just talk tonight about how these things, in my mind, come together a little bit. And I apologize if this is not as schematic and straightforward as it might be, but just indulge me for a little while. If we're going to talk about solar panels, let's talk for a minute about why they're important. The reason they're important above all else is that we do totter on the very edge of an extraordinary climate crisis, the biggest problem by far that humans have ever wandered into. And as David said, I've been working on this a long time. I wrote the first book about it back in the 1980s. And sadly, most of what we said was going to happen back then has already happened. In fact, it's happened somewhat faster and more dramatically than we would have guessed in the late 20th century. Turned out the Earth was more finely balanced than we really quite hoped. And as a result, the change in temperature we've seen so far, about 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2-point-something degrees Fahrenheit rise in global temperature, has been enough to knock an extraordinary number of things out of kilter. On a day-to-day basis, of course, the way that we really experience this for the most part is based on the simple physical principle that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid areas we get these more evaporation, more drought, and then eventually things catch fire. And that's happening now each year on an ever more accelerated scale, so much so that I think we're almost, and this is very sad and dangerous, beginning to get used to it a little bit and not paying it quite the mind we should. It's less than 18 months ago that America's second largest city, large parts of it burned to the ground in a week-long firestorm unlike anything we've really ever seen before, you know. But so much has happened in the intervening year and a half that we've kind of memory holed it. Stuff like that is happening all the time. This year, America is running way ahead of its normal pace for wildfire already, and that's because we had, and I hope you enjoyed it, a true old-school winter in Vermont. We were almost alone. Yes, I made full use of it, I must say. But the rest of the country, for America as a whole, despite our coldness up here in the northeast corner, this was the second warmest winter in American history, and by far the warmest for the western two-thirds of the country, where they had essentially no snow. They're referring to what they have up in the Rockies and the Sierras now as the no-pack. Because where there should still be feet of snow up there this time of year, there's nothing, it's all gone, and the fires are breaking out already. Once that water has evaporated up in the atmosphere, of course, it's going to come down we're all a little too familiar in Vermont with what happens when it does. Our two extraordinary deluges of this decade have brought home to us the fact that there's no such thing really as a climate refuge, and certainly not in a state with as steep mountains and narrow valleys as Vermont possesses. I live in Ripton, and the last time we were cut off both sides for, the highway was taken out both directions out of town for days on end. So, bad as those things are, they pale in comparison with what's happening in the rest of the world, where we're not paying as much attention and where people are not buffered by the amount of wealth that Americans still have. When the rains ended in Vermont last time, I was paying attention to rainfall, and so noted that just almost as it ended here, it began to rain at unprecedented level in North Africa. They got the biggest rainstorm they ever had, and in Libya, the biggest river there burst through 2 dams, swept into a coastal city, and washed 10,000 people out to sea, where they drowned in the course of an hour. That kind of biblical scale craziness is happening place after place after place around the world now. We think there are already tens of millions of people who've had to leave their homes because they're too hot, they're underwater, they're on fire, or whatever it is. The UN estimates that number will be between 1 and 3 billion people in the course of this century on our current warming trajectory. And just in passing, to remind ourselves of the deep injustice here, forget Libya, all of Africa has produced about 3% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that caused this crisis. The 4% of us who call ourselves Americans are accountable for about 25%. So by rudimentary moral math, if 10,000 people get swept out to sea in Libya and drown, 2,500 of them are on us, Now we're beginning to do not just the kind of scary and superficial damage that I've been describing, but we're beginning to affect the most basic underlying physical systems of the Earth. The jet stream, which draws its power from the temperature differential between the equator and the poles, as we rapidly heat the North Pole, that jet stream is getting stuck in funky high amplitude positions, leading to long sieges of extreme weather on either side. A couple of 100 miles to our east in the Atlantic, we may now be witnessing the beginning of what would be the biggest event in the course of span of human history. It looks like the great currents of the Atlantic, the biggest heat distribution engine on the planet, their combined flow 100 times the volume of the Amazon River. It looks like those are beginning to collapse as fresh water pours off of melting Greenland. That changes the salinity and hence the density of seawater in the North Atlantic, and it's that density differences that drive these giant conveyor belts. The leading expert on all of this said we're now at a place where there's a 50% chance of this system really failing in the course of this century, which is very, very scary and sobering news. And we have very little time to figure it out. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that if we wanted to stay on anything like the timetable we laid out in Paris just a decade ago, then we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is now 3 years and 6 months away. So we have our work cut out for us. And it would be, and by the way, we're going to get a preview of coming attractions in the course of the next 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, because the El Nino that's about to break across the Pacific is essentially going to demonstrate to us what normal weather circa 2035 or so will be looking like. It looks like now it's going to be a very strong El Nino, and so one can expect a certain amount of chaos. I'll keep trying to speak up, sorry. All of this would be hard enough to deal with if we were all working in good faith. But of course, we're not working in good faith, which brings one to the second problem that we're enmeshed in, and that's the democracy crisis, the authoritarian crisis that's overtaking us. I'm not going to particularly belabor it tonight because I think everyone's capable of sort of, in their own minds, isolating what seems to them the most egregious of all the, my list changes almost hourly. I gotta say, being forced to watch as the White House carried out a cage fight on the White House lawn does make one wonder how the country that began with Franklin and Jefferson and Adams and Washington has quite reached the pitch that it's in. We did a project over the last few weeks at Third Act across the country. We have about 120,000 people now in Third Act across America. And a fairly high number of them are in their 80s, 90s, 100s. So we were talking with a bunch of those people over videotape, getting them to tape things just to try and isolate why this moment seems different. I mean, look, there have been presidents I didn't like, on and off again my whole life, but there's something very different happening now, and we wanted to kind of isolate that and in a way that would sort of give other older Americans a permission structure to begin, breaking with it. So we did all these interviews, and they really were powerful. The gimmick, the idea behind it was that anybody who's 83 or older at this point has been alive for 1/3 of Americans' official history, since we're turning 250 in a few weeks. And, that should give you a certain amount of credibility as a kind of baseline witness to things. But it was remarkable to listen to what people were saying, to hear somebody say, my sister died of polio when I was 4. What do you think it makes me feel like to watch Bobby Kennedy screwing around with vaccinations? Or, some guy who said, I was commissioned in the Navy 65 years ago, I grew up with my Pearl Harbor generation. What do you think it makes me feel like to watch our president talk about how much fun it is to bomb Iran? The sense that something very different and dark has been unleashed is obvious and real, and very bound up and linked with this climate crisis that I've been describing. In fact, I think there's no accident that these crises go hand in hand, and that the key linkage here has to do with the fossil fuel industry. By many measures, until the rise of the tech giants, the single most powerful and rich industry on the planet. The idea, the science behind climate change came 40 years ago as an extraordinary threat to this industry and the people in it. We now know from great investigative reporting and whistleblowers and archival documents and things that the big oil companies were busily investigating climate change back in the 1980s when Jim Hansen was doing his first work at NASA. Exxon was the biggest company in the world. They had huge scientific staff. Their product was carbon. Of course they were going to try and figure it out. And they did. We now know that they understood with even finer precision than NASA what the temperature was going to be in the year 2020. They understood it and they believed it. Exxon started to work building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was in the offing. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, across this industry, they joined together in building this big, expansive architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept us locked in an utterly insane debate about whether or not global warming was real for 40 years. A debate, remember, that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie, and it became the most consequential lie in human history because it cost us the one thing we can't get back, sort of time to deal with all of this. The players are, go right down to, the Koch brothers, whose work did so much to dismantle the foundations of our democracy over the last 30 or 40 years, they're the biggest oil and gas barons in the U.S. They own more refinery and pipeline capacity than anyone else. And so it's no wonder that from the beginning they were taking on climate change and it was here, I think, more than anywhere else, that our leaders began to train us to accept one lie after another. If you could accept the lie that physics and chemistry were wrong and that we didn't need to worry about climate change and whatever, then there was probably no limit to the number of lies that you could at least try to get away with. And so now we pretend that our elections have been rigged or, whatever, that immigrants present violent threat to America or all the other things that statistically are as ridiculous as global warming denial, but also serve the same set of people and the same set of interests. It became obvious and powerful during the last election. You'll recall that candidate Trump told the oil industry that if they gave him $1 billion in donations, he would give them anything they wanted. They ponied up about $500 million between donations and advertising and lobbying in the last election cycle, and that was clearly enough because Trump, I think, has given them even more than they expected. The assault on clean energy has been truly, truly shocking. To try and shut down wind farms off the New England coast that were 90% complete, to put all federal land off limits to solar panels. You'll recall that the Postal Service was beginning to roll out electric trucks, which made enormous sense. By definition, mail trucks go back and park in the same place every night, and you can charge them up and whatever. They're saving lots of money, quiet, non-polluting. The Postal Service has apparently been ripping out the chargers in the, salting the earth to make sure that something like this doesn't ever happen again. A few weeks ago, we had the privilege as taxpayers of sending a couple of $1 billion off to foreign companies to buy back the wind leasing rights that they had leased off the coast to make sure that that wind never got harvested. So, not good. But here is the point where it gets interesting, because this fight over climate and democracy has a new and interesting wrinkle, and that wrinkle is the fact that over the last 4 or 5 years, and this is really the subject of this book of mine, the last 48 months or so, there has been an extraordinary surge in the use of clean energy around this planet. This is the stuff that for our whole lifetimes we've been calling alternative energy. And that's a name that we should dispense with now because there's nothing alternative about it. It's the obvious, common sense, straightforward way to power the planet, and people are figuring that out. 95% of new electric generation around the world last year came from the sun and the wind. The reason is that about 5 years ago, we passed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce energy from the sun, and wind power is just another form of solar energy. The sun heats the earth differentially, producing the winds that turn those majestic turbines. It became cheaper to produce power that way than by setting stuff on fire. which is a big deal because human beings have been happily setting stuff on fire for 700,000 years. I mean, Darwin said fire and language were the two things that distinguished our species, you know. So it's remarkable to imagine that we can, if we wanted to, put out those fires at an extraordinary pace. And there are places around the world that are demonstrating what that pace could look like. China, above all, China's where about half this work is being done, and it's truly remarkable to see what they're doing. This time last year, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant, so they were building one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours, okay? When you do things at that kind of pace, the results can be pretty remarkable. California is the one state that really has taken this as seriously as, at least a little bit, as we need to, and they've done pretty remarkable things over the last few years. They haven't done everything perfectly, but they've now got enough solar panels in place and wind turbines that most days California is producing more than 100% of the energy it uses from renewable energy for significant parts of the day. When the sun goes down at night, the biggest source of supply to the grid now are batteries that have spent the afternoon soaking up excess sunshine. California, as a result, is using 60% less natural gas to produce electricity now than they were 3 years ago. This is the 4th largest economy in the world. So when I told you a few minutes ago that we were going to have to cut emissions by half by 2030, you all sighed and thought that's impossible. And it is impossible. We're not going to do it quite that fast on a global basis. But we can move with extraordinary speed if we want to. And you can see it happening not only in big centralized economies like China or in entrepreneurial capitalist places like California, but you can see it happening in, most beautifully, the poorest parts of the world right now. In Pakistan, which has taken more hits from climate change, I think, than any country on earth, perhaps. The summer temperature in its cities are routinely now 125 degrees. 2010 and 2023, they had the 2 biggest floods on this planet since Noah, okay? The last one displaced 35 million people. They have one geographic advantage, however, which is a border with China. And across that border over the last 18 months have come an unbelievable number of solar panels. Not so much a government program, just people fed up with expensive, unreliable electricity, buying these things, going on YouTube to figure out how to hook them together. They've built the equivalent of half the country's electric grid out of rooftop solar panels in the course of 18 months, okay? The place that it's happening fastest right now, and this is kind of a tragic story, but a very real one, the place that it's happening fastest right now in the world is Cuba, where they are desperate to try and figure out how to keep anything going, especially things like hospitals, now that we have imposed a total embargo on oil reaching their country, because we can't, you know. I don't think Cuba will be able to put up solar panels fast enough to forestall, but they are trying, and they're going up at extraordinary speed. Now, given the economics of all of this, we could just kind of sit back and let economics do its thing, and eventually we'll get where we need to be. 40 years from now, we're going to run this planet on sun and wind just because it's cheap. But if it takes us anything like 40 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. That's how fast things are now happening in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Gulf Stream, in the melting big ice sheet of West Antarctica, on and on and on. So I think that our job is to figure out how to speed up this transition, how to catalyze this reaction in as many places as we can, But in many ways, the place in the world that needs it most right now is the US. And frankly, one of the places in the US that needs it pretty badly is Vermont. We haven't done what we should be doing here. Vermont, the very first, I told you that the first solar panel in the world came out of Bell Labs in 1956. 13 years before that, in 1943, the first industrial wind turbine in the world was at Grandpa's Knob in Castleton. And it produced energy for a number of years. Vermont had a de facto ban on wind turbines in this state for the last decade because Montpelier got scared of people who didn't want to look at wind turbines. And so we stopped doing it. And that's a great shame because that's one of the resources that we should be using, like people are around the world, to provide as much clean power as we possibly can. The power that we're going to need if we're going to convert our automobile fleet to EVs or e-bikes or e-buses, if we're going to convert our wasteful furnaces to heat pumps, if we're going to turn the gas stoves in too many Vermont homes that produce not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also make it 50% more likely that kids will get asthma. If we're going to convert those to induction cooktops, we need a lot of electrons. And you know, wind turbines are one place to get them, and solar panels are the other. And so we're going to have to push hard to make this happen in the time that we have. And it's going to be hard everywhere, including here. The Koch brothers have set up shop in Vermont. Americans for Prosperity has become a big part of our political scene in the last few years, and they're pushing back hard on what needs to happen. So this brings me finally back to my description of nonviolent social movements as the other great technology of the 20th century. A kind of unlikely tool for allowing the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few. And we need very deep campaigns around this work, and we're starting to build them. In the fall, last fall, some of you helped with Sun Day, the first big nationwide celebration we've had of renewable energy in this country. We had 500 events across America. It was quite beautiful. I mean, there were concerts and things, but there were also a lot of Habitat for Humanity homes that went up that day with solar panels on the roof and on and on and on. And it kicked off this, what's been a very successful legislative effort in state capitals around the country to get a couple of things done. Not huge things. We can't do huge things at the moment because Washington is in the hands of morons. But we can push hard to change that, and that's what I'm spending most of my time doing. And in the meantime, we can work hard in the Montpeliers of the world. The two things that we worked really hard on were bills to allow easier permitting for rooftop solar power. Americans pay 3 times as much as Australians or Europeans to put solar panels up. It doesn't have to do with the cost of the panels. It has to do with the fact that we have more regulation than we need here. Every town has its own building code, its own team of inspectors who would like to climb up on your roof, like you to exchange drawings back and forth, on and on and on. The rest of the world, this is like buying a refrigerator. You call somebody up on Monday, by Wednesday they're up on the roof, by Friday it's connected to the grid, you're pumping. What happens when you do that? In Australia, where 40% of homes have put solar panels on the roof, they now have so much electricity in the middle of the day that beginning on the 1st of July, every Australian is going to get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon from noon to 3. That's when they're going to charge their cars. They're actually going to figure out how you program your dishwasher so that it operates at a certain time. They're all buying storage batteries so they can load them up in the afternoon with free electricity and run their home at night. That's what happens when you put good public policy into work instead of just listening to people who say, I don't want to look at solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, whatever it is. The second campaign that we've been at work on is even more fun. It's this, what we're calling balcony solar or plug-in solar. This is the most granular part of this whole story, is the tiniest way to do this work. 4 or 5 million apartments across Europe in the last 3 years people have gone to IKEA, come home for a few €100 with a panel designed not to be put on the roof, but just zip tied to the railing of their balcony. And then you just plug it into the wall. It has a plug, that's it. No electrician required. Often produces 25% of the power that an apartment uses, so not everything, but not nothing either. And I'm very happy to say that we're now at 9 states across the country this spring that have approved this balcony solar stuff. Maine and Virginia and Colorado and Utah and New Hampshire. And I think the 10th should be Vermont, because I think the bill is now sitting on the governor's desk, if I'm correct. So it's not going to cost Vermont anything. I can't actually think of any possible reason that Phil Scott would not approve it, but it would be nice to just remind him that this would be an easy win for him. We're going to need to do lots more of that kind of campaigning. And indeed, you could mark your calendars now, because we're just over 1 year away from the second iteration of this Sun Day thing, which will be at the summer solstice next year, June 20th, and it'll be global, so that we can have a global celebration of all that's going on. And we've been talking with lots of musicians and artists and things, and figuring out how to drive home to human beings the news that we have this incredible project to work on together over the next 4 or 5 years, and that if we did, we could change the destiny of all the people who are going to come after us. So we work on that hard. But we also, of course, have to work hard on making our democracy somehow survive the current siege that it's under. Because that's essential for its own reasons. It's essential for the lives of endless numbers of vulnerable people. It's essential because I would like to have a full night's sleep again sometime in my life. It is essential if we're ever going to do this climate stuff the way that we should. And so, it comes in many forms, this resistance, as everybody at Indivisible and Third Act and everybody else has been working on this year. Some of the work is electoral. In fact, between now and November, that's the highest leverage work that we can do. And don't despair, because it's going reasonably well. If we could have that election tomorrow, and if that election was even reasonably fair and transparent, I have no doubt that we would be able to regain at least some foothold of power in DC, and that would make an extraordinary difference if we could do it. So figure out ways to help. As I said, Becca Balint should be, if Becca Balint is going to lose the election, then we're in such a bad place that take up psychedelic drugs instead. But I'm pretty confident she's going to be okay. Figure out how to help elsewhere, and I'll give you some suggestions along the way. But of course, there's much more than the electoral part of this. Increasingly, we're understanding that we're actually also going to have to sometimes put our bodies on the line in this fight. We are very, very, very lucky that the Trump administration chose to make its first real showdown with the American people in Minneapolis this past winter, because it went into a place where there were existing networks of people, And they rose to the occasion like nothing. I think the single most impressive use of nonviolence since 1955 and the Montgomery bus boycott. I think it's as beautiful as that, which is 70 years ago this winter was playing out, as beautiful as the Salt March across India 95 years ago. The same level of extraordinary bravery and commitment and absolute, well, as an organizer, it was beautiful to watch because there were no obvious big leaders and there were no real egos involved in the whole thing. And I'm sure that there was lots and lots of painful discussion and, you know, a certain amount of the infighting that all of that obviously was on, but people kept it together and they refused to rise to the provocations that the Trump administration was desperately trying to get them to rise to. They wouldn't take the bait, they wouldn't be provoked, they wouldn't be goaded, and they did win. You know, not completely, we're never going to win completely while these guys are around, but many, many, many fewer of their neighbors are being carted off now than were 3 or 4 months ago. That really should be a guide for all of us as this action comes to other parts of the country. Obviously, people in Chittenden County have already dealt with it a little bit, and we've had great leadership from groups like Migrant Justice and so on in really helping. But it's going to take that same kind of discipline to really do what people in Minnesota did. And I have no doubt that we're capable of it if it comes to it here, but start being involved in the kind of networks and groups that will allow us to play that role when it comes to it. Now, as I get near the end, let me say one of the important questions is who exactly should be doing this work? And as I'm able to survey the demographics of this audience. So I can tell you that my firm belief is one of the groups of people who should be doing this is people of a certain age, you know. We started Third Act because, well, when I was sort of nosing the idea around with people, a lot of the organizers and things I talked to just shook their heads and said, this won't work. People become more conservative as they age. Old people are the problem, okay? You know, there's something to that. You get more stuff, and that has a conservatizing influence or whatever. But if it was true at other points, I think much less true now. Because if you think about it, if you're in your third act now, if you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s, let's say, it means that your first act came in this period of extraordinary social and cultural and political transformation and liberation in the 1960s and 1970s. The apex of the civil rights movement, the moment when we started taking women seriously in public life, the first Earth Day in 1970, when 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population, went into the streets. I mean, we've all done a good job with No King's Day, but this was twice as big with half as many people in the country, you know, and unbelievably effective. Within 18 months, we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, we had the EPA, we had all the things that they're trying still to gut 55 years later, you know. So there's a kind of muscle memory in our generations that's not available to younger people. You know, it's very hard, I think, being younger at the moment for a number of reasons, but one of which is if you're, you know, 25 now or something, you've lived most of your conscious life in a world where Donald Trump seems like a fairly obvious and normal, or, you know, normal part of, you have no way of understanding that, I mean, you may get that he's a bad guy, but you have no way of understanding that he is very different from the other bad guy, you know, whoever else we've had in the past, you know? I mean, George W. Bush is the luckiest president of all time because he only served a decade as the worst president in American history, and now we would all give our eye teeth to have him back. So we have real advantages here in our kind of ability to understand what could happen, and we have to put them to use. In backing up the young people who are necessarily going to be leading this work. One of the things I'm doing a lot of as I go around the country from one campaign to another is working with other third actors to say, look, you might think that we would be lining up behind whoever the older candidate is, but in fact, just the opposite. We think in many cases it's time for the next generation to be taking over. It's going to be one of the really powerful arguments, for instance, in Maine. Obviously a somewhat fraught place, but I'm headed there in a couple of days. And then I'm headed off to Texas before much longer. That's one of the most powerful and beautiful races in this country, and it really is about a kind of new and old way of looking at the world, summed up in Mr. Tallarico, fundamentally challenging what Christianity means in our politics in America in the 21st century. This is a truly powerful time, and older people are going to play a huge role in it, if for no other reason than there is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? Everybody in this room voted in the last election. That's huge power. If we can shift by 2 or 3% how older people will vote in the midterm elections in the fall, that will be enough to recapture Washington, and I think we can do it. And if we can't, we'll have another discussion at some point. I wrote a book a few years ago called Radio Free Vermont that was, sort of a playful consideration of whether the day might come when Vermont should strike out on its own. It seems a little less playful now, and there are days when I think that a kind of Republic of New England with its capital in Boston, would not be the worst thing in the entire world. But let's hope we can keep it from coming to that. Let's hope that we can grab once again the sort of central ideas, the good ones out of American history, and try once more to make them the center of our national life. So I'll just end by saying there's obviously lots to be scared of. And I am scared all the time. I really do wake up at 3 most mornings and just kind of lie there thinking, what can I do next? What's the next thing? But there's also a lot to work with, and we haven't had before. And if we can figure out how to link those two technologies to the best possible means, the solar panel that offers a kind of liberating way of powering the world that breaks down some of that centralization, and the nonviolent movement that's going to be necessary to spread it as quickly as we need it. If we do those things, then no guarantees at all, but we've got a fighting chance, and that's a good thing. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill. Many of you, when you registered, you put some questions in as part of the registration form, and we grouped them. My wife grouped them. And so we have you covered many of the questions that folks had already put forward. But I wanted to start with something really practical. What are the 3 most impactful things that the average person or family can do for the climate? What are the 3 most impactful things?
So, it's a very good question, of course. And, in the short run, the things that when we can do, we should do, are put solar panels on the roof and make sure that we're moving ourselves around with electricity or muscle power, not fossil fuel. But, I mean, I've had solar panels on my roof for 25 years, and I'm happy about it, and I'm glad that they connect to the EV in the garage. But I don't try and fool myself that we're going to deal with this thing one garage at a time, one, vegan dinner at a time, whatever. The most important thing an individual can do, Mark, is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make big change in the economic and political ground rules. That's why we set up things like Indivisible or Third Act. And if you're over 60, really, we don't really check IDs. So if you think you can pass for 60, you're welcome to join us at Third Act. But we also collaborate all the time with Indivisible and 350 and all sorts of other groups that have great presence here in Vermont too. So just find other people to do this work with. The American default towards individualism is as much a problem as a help in this case, I think.
Thank you. I do qualify for Third Act at this point. So, next question, and there were little flyers at the seats. Can you talk about biomass biofuels for electricity generation?
Yeah.
And why is it problematic?
Burning wood to make electricity turns out not to be a particularly good idea. It's not to say that the people who thought it up in the first place were wrong-headed. They were trying to do an interesting thing. We didn't understand then what we do now. And Bill McKibben from Tufts came and really explained this before the Burlington City Council a couple of years ago when McNeil was, really in the sights. The problem is that when you cut down a tree and burn it up to produce electricity, you put a big pulse of carbon dioxide into the air right now. So theoretically, 50 years from now, the next set of forests growing up will soak up that CO2. The trouble is we're breaking the back of the climate system right now. So that pulse of CO2 at the moment, and burning wood is an inefficient way to produce electricity, produces a big pulse of CO2. That's the problem. It's wrecking and so it would be very difficult set of problems to grapple with if we didn't have wind and sun power that provide potentially quite inexpensive and very low impact ways to do the same thing. Now, it doesn't come without cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch in this business, but there are radically less expensive lunches. And that's what solar power and wind power are. You have to do some mining to make them work. You need some cobalt and but by comparison to what we do now, not much. The Rocky Mountain Institute estimated in a big study 2 years ago that all the minerals that we need for the renewable battery revolution by 2050 would require less volume of mining than the amount of coal we mined last year on this planet, okay? So the chance to really shift here is dramatic. It also takes some land. Not all the land, a little bit of the land. We think about 2% of the land surface of the country, which is a quite useful amount of land to devote to a crop that we use a lot of, electrons. At the moment, for instance, America's biggest crop is corn. We grow 60 million acres of it. 30 million acres of that corn is grown to produce ethanol. On 30 million acres of America, we grow gasoline. That ethanol produces 3% of the energy that America uses. If you covered those same cornfields with solar panels, you'd produce not 3% of the energy, but roughly 100% of the energy that America currently uses. Now, we don't want to cover Indiana and Iowa stem to stern with solar panels. We don't want to cover the Champlain Valley stem to stern with solar panels. But if someone says, we need to put in 200 acres of solar panels here, that should be no more controversial than saying we need to put in 200 acres of corn here. In fact, it should be somewhat less controversial because solar panels work even if you don't pour large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus on them, okay? Which then wash down into Lake Champlain, and we're gonna need to spend several $1 billion to try and clean it up. And once you've filled that cornfield or whatever it is with solar panels, you're left with half the field to work with. The land in between those solar panels is the sort of biggest new canvas that humans have come up with for our ingenuity in the last decades. And people are doing spectacular things. There travels under the clunky name of agrivoltaics, so we could use a better name. But the stuff that's happening is great. In Middlebury, a couple of my neighbors, Mike Kiernan and Tanya, his wife, have built this great nonprofit they call Be the Change, which on solar farms across Vermont has been interplanting the rows with pollinator-friendly weeds and flowers. And the results have been truly amazing. Like 100 times more pollinating insects than on the farm fields that they were replacing. So the neighboring orchards and fields are getting huge increases in pollination, in fruit set, in whatever. And we're taking a bite out of the biodiversity crisis at the same time that we're dealing with the climate crisis. So there are, if we can, we really need in Vermont, and this is, there are, I mean, I love Vermont so dearly, but there are times when I think our state motto should be, change anything you want once I'm dead, okay? And it really can't be like that. We actually have to do this now and get it done.
Thank you, Bill. Two more questions, and then I'll wrap it up. The first question is, do we fight climate change only with technology, or do we have to change how much resources and energy we will use in the future?
That's a very, very good question and a fair one. And I've spent a lot of my time, my life, working on those questions of reimagining what we need. Probably in this wonderful library, there's a copy of a book of mine called Deep Economy from 15 or 20 years ago that really tried to take on this question of economic growth and what it means and so on. And I think what it means is less than we imagine, i.e., its real weakness, besides the environmental problems, is that it doesn't make us as happy as it claims to. I think we're interesting species, and I think that 100 years from now, we'll have decided that what we're really built for is contact with other people and contact with the natural world around us, and I think we will be adjusting our amusements and practices accordingly. But do I think that's going to happen in the next 5 years when we need to cut emissions by 50%? I do not. 100 million people enter the consuming class on this planet each year now, most of them in Asia. I'm pretty sure that most of them are going to tread at least partway down the path that we have blazed out for them. So I think it's really important to keep every interesting experiment that we have going with permaculture, with co-housing, with on and on and on. But counting on those things to radically shift the amount of energy that we're using is folly. That doesn't mean that there aren't things happening now that are producing enormous and unexpected changes. The most profound of those was the cruel and absurd war that we launched over the last 10 or 11 weeks in Iran. A monument to stupidity, but there are a lot of countries around the world who have suddenly realized that while sunlight has to travel 93 million miles to reach the Earth, none of those miles go through the Strait of Hormuz. So the possibilities are dawning on people all over the place very quickly. But I do think that we need to have technology in place to allow people to be imperfect humans without destroying the planet. And I think that as we put up those things, we move at least incrementally to subvert the world order that we're in now. The beauty of renewable energy is that it is produced close to home. Vermont can't produce oil. Thank God, we've got nothing of value beneath our soil. You know? Vermont can't produce it, but Vermont ships $2 billion a year out of state to buy oil. We just write a $2 billion check to Houston or Saudi Arabia or whatever every year. Think what that money would be doing in Vermont if we were just relying on sun and wind to produce, because we've got plenty of it, you know. So we have real interesting possibilities for beginning to bring some things closer to home and under somewhat more small d democratic control. I think it's one of the most subversive things we could be doing at the moment.
Thank you. And now the last question, which was on the minds of many who have come here this evening, and it comes back to something you've spoken to already, and that's what gives you hope. How do you find hope in this current environment? And it could be even on a personal level.
Well, there are days when I'm not a Pollyanna by the title of the first book that I wrote about all this back in the 1980s had the cheerful title, The End of Nature. Okay, so don't confuse me with a real optimist. And the losses that we have already suffered are enormous, and they're going to be dwarfed by the losses that are coming no matter what we do at this point, because we've put in train what we're playing for now, really, is not whether we can stop global warming, much too late for that. It's whether we can stop it short of the point where it cuts civilizations off at the knees. And it's not at all clear that we can, but we may be able to. We may still have that within our power, and so we should. In part, that's what gives me not so much hope, but the power to get up in the morning and keep going. We can't stop global warming, but we almost certainly can shave tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets. And every tenth of a degree that we raise the planet's temperature moves roughly 100 million of our brothers and sisters from a relatively safe climate zone to a relatively dangerous one. So this is by far the biggest opportunity that humans have ever had to look out for each other. Some days, it's not hope at all. Some days, I just wake up and think, man, do I dislike the oil companies. How much trouble could I cause for them today? And some days, I just wake up and think it's such an extraordinary, at some level, and this really is, I guess, the place to end. At some level, climate change is the test of whether or not the big brain was a good adaptation or not. It clearly can get us into a lot of trouble, and can it get us out of that trouble? And the longer I do this work, the more convinced I am that the answer to that lies less with the size of the brain than with the size of the heart that it's attached to. And that's why it's good to be in a room with a lot of big-hearted people. Thank you all.
Thank you again, and thank you to Barbara Shatar for hosting this evening. So gracious in making the library available and bringing this event together with us. And thank you again to Third Act Vermont as well for all the good work they do. And of course, Queen City Indivisible. Hope you learn more about us and you get involved. There are books for sale. Here Comes the Sun over there, as well as Bill's signing books. So thanks again, everybody, for coming this evening.
Best achievements
Thank you, man, very much. Let me know how to help you. You don't have a print.
Bob McKibben. And do you ever have you ever been able to put one of your presentations, which we just heard now, on YouTube? Oh, yeah. So is it available on YouTube?
I'm afraid if you Google me, you'll find 700 variations of that particular thing.
Thank you. Well, it's not the first time I've heard you. Excellent.
Many thanks.
Excellent.
Did you make this out to my sister Carol? She's feeling poorly. She couldn't make it. No.
So, what did you think about it?
I think Bill McKibben is urging the white hairs among us to get involved because of our muscle memory of protesting and doing good is truly inspiring. So I will get more involved.
Thank you.
This was like seriously like interesting and important for us to be like discussing this, to be listening and learning about like this like topic, and to come up with like solutions and like different ideas of what we could do to help like solve like this like issue, because there are like many other different like solutions that could be like done to go ahead and help fight against this like climate crisis. And like one of the most important like things we need to be doing right now is like taking action. So I'm really grateful to be at this event and to be listening to like this offer, and being able to go ahead and be like surrounded by all these like community members who also like care and who also like relate to the experience of waking up at around like 3:30 in the morning and not being able to go back to sleep for the remainder of the day. So it'll be good to like hopefully one day have one day in the future just get like a good like full night's of like rest, being at like peace that this like issue is like being like solved, and that like the next generation will have to like deal with this kind of like stuff in like the future, like to a worse like degree. It seemed as if like last like century, like one of the biggest like issues was like global war, like the end of the world like coming up, and like still to this like day that's like an issue that happens like every like decade, it seems. But hopefully we'll come to a decade where we don't have to worry about that. So like. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much to Bill McKibben and the library for a really great event, and Third Act and Queen City Indivisible. And I hope people are really inspired to take action.
So I'm David McColgan. I'm one of the co-facilitators of Third Act Vermont, and I was just really happy to work with Indivisible on bringing Bill McKibben to talk with us tonight. He gave a very moving and powerful presentation, and I loved especially how he ended it, which is that he's hoping that humans actually have hearts that are bigger than our brains, and it's our hearts that will pull us towards solutions to our climate crisis. Thank you.